Great. Well, it's 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Lisa Edens. I'm the program coordinator with the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education. And welcome to our last webinar of 2020. Yay, the year is almost over. And this is all about hands-on strategies for supporting social and emotional learning through EE. So we're really excited for our speaker today. But before I introduce her, if you're not familiar with the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education, we are a network of professional environmental educators all across the state of Colorado with a mission to advance environmental education in Colorado by fostering collaboration, mobilizing support, and driving excellence. And one way that we hope to drive excellence in the field is through our monthly webinar series. So we try to choose topics that are relevant and of interest to the EE community here with the goals of sharing and sparking ideas, helping improve our practice, and most importantly, connecting with one another. We do have our next webinar, our first webinar in 2021 will be January 28th, which is a Certification 101 webinar. So if you're curious to know a little bit more about the certification program here in Colorado or have questions about the portfolio, you can get all of your questions answered by our Executive Director, Katie Navin, at that webinar. We also have our continued resources around COVID-19 up on our website. So in addition to the resources, we do have monthly calls. If you haven't been on one, they are a great way to just share challenges and opportunities and ideas and anything with others in the field. And we have those that focus on professional development, sustaining operations, and adapting program models. So we invite you to attend those as well. By now, I think we're all well experienced in Zoom, but just to remind everyone to just keep your line muted while others are speaking. That just helps reduce our background noise. Please use the chat function. It's so important for just making this feel more interactive. So if you've got a resource to share, an idea, a question, anything that comes up, please chat that in so that we can just keep this as interactive as possible. And then I mentioned if you could chat in your name, organization, where you're connecting from, that's great as well, just to help kind of foster those connections. And then you will receive today's recording, so no need to take copious notes unless that's your style. You'll receive the full recording along with links to resources and those sorts of things. And typically we do a land acknowledgement and recognition of racial injustice when we do professional development or webinars, but Estrella has that as part of her presentation. So I'm going to defer to her on those, and we will, honor our Native communities here in Colorado when she does that. So without further ado, I know she has some great information to share, so I want to get on to her. I want to introduce you to Estrella Risinger, and she is the Executive Director of the Association of Environmental and Outdoor Education, where she works to advance the impact of environmental and outdoor education in California. Estrella recently served as the National Education Manager at Nature Bridge, which is the largest education partner of the National Park Service, and as a project manager of the Residential Environmental Education Partnership, a national collaborative convened by Nature Bridge, which focused on understanding and elevating the role of social and emotional learning within residential learning centers. Estrella helped to launch the website grow-outside.org, and we'll put that in the chat, which is a social and emotional learning toolkit for residential environmental learning centers. So she has great information, great expertise to share. She's a former classroom teacher and camp counselor, and she has a background in both formal and informal educational settings. So I will pass it on to Estrella.
Great. Well, thank you. It is so lovely to be here virtually with you all today. Again, my name is Estrella Risinger. My pronouns are she, her. And you got to hear a little bit about my bio, so I'm not going to repeat any of that. But, I just want to share that while I am so honored that the Colorado team invited me here today, first I should just share that I'm no expert. I continue to learn every day about social and emotional learning. how it shows up or doesn't in different contexts, and what we can do to support social and emotional learning, or SEL, in different types of settings. And I will talk about some of those settings and some of those kind of different strategies today, and hopefully you will walk away with some tangible tools that you can take into your own practice. So I personally am coming at you live from Oakland, California. I want to acknowledge that I sit on stolen land that has been cared for by Chochenyo Ohlone for millennia. They are one of the more than 100 federally recognized tribes here in California. I want to share my appreciation for the past and present stewardship of this place I call home, and commit to shaping a future here that is just. Nature centers and environmental education programs often sit on public lands, and in some cases, national, state, regional parks. But I would say wherever you are coming from, or whatever your workplace setting, acknowledging the original inhabitants and being transparent about the site and the region's history is a really important aspect of helping students to develop a sense of place and model inclusivity and equity, all essential components of environmental education and of social and emotional learning. For me, I don't believe that SEL can really be separated from equity and inclusion, and while they aren't the same, there is a tremendous amount of overlap, and being aware of where you are and the history of that place are really important components of SEL. And if you are not fully aware of kind of where you sit, I highly recommend these two resources. I'll go ahead and put them into the chat. And I would love to see if there are folks who are aware of some of the original caretakers and current stewards of the places where they're coming from. It would be great to have that shared as well. And I will certainly invite our Colorado team if you'd like to say anything to acknowledge the tribal members of your state.
Sure. What we know as Colorado today was the traditional home of the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Pueblo tribes, the Shoshone tribe, and the Ute Nation. So those are the land which Colorado sits on now. Thanks, Estrella.
Thank you. So here's what I'm hoping to accomplish together today. This is our roadmap for how we'll spend the rest of this hour. And I do hope to bring in some opportunities for interaction and reflection, but just kind of acknowledging that this is a limited time frame. If we had a whole day to interact, in person, obviously this would be different. We would have a lot of conversation, a lot of engagement and activity, and I will do my best, but want to kind of recognize just some of those just constraints in the current setting. Additionally, if we were in a different format, I would spend time creating shared expectations and establishing some community agreements for how, we would interact and show up together. Today, given the time, we're just going to dive right in. So this is what I am hoping over the course of this hour we will touch on. I hope that we will spend time really deepening your understanding, or for some of you who are new to talking about SEL, giving you some tools, a framework to lean on. I hope that you'll get a chance to actually practice some of the strategies that we're talking about, and we'll spend a little time with that toolkit that was mentioned, the Grow Outside resource in particular, to make sure that you have some materials that you can walk away with right away. So I want to start kind of at the very beginning, and really talk about why are we even having this conversation? Why social and emotional learning? Well, just to start off, social and emotional learning is, while it's certainly risen in prominence in recent years, it is not a new term. It's been around for several decades, but it really has been, I'd say, the last 5 years, and especially the last 3, that we are starting to hear it more regularly. I'd say most school systems at this point have some acknowledgement of social and emotional learning. Many states have their own standards related to social and emotional learning, and it's certainly a topic of teacher training, curriculum, etc. So I'm so glad that this is a topic that you in Colorado are talking about, and I think it's especially important that those of us who work with the formal education system, or kind of in collaboration with formal educators, and certainly the young people who are in those systems, that we also are well versed in the terminology. And so again, why are we even talking about it? So social and emotional learning, quality instruction can lead in the short term to SEL skill acquisition and improved attitudes about self, others, school. But in the long term, when you think about the kinds of impacts, they're pretty tremendous. We're looking at positive social behavior, academic success, fewer conduct problems, and less emotional distress. These are skills that we know are useful throughout life for maintaining personal relationships, managing interactions with coworkers, making financially and socially responsible decisions, I'd say environmentally responsible decisions, and for maintaining emotional well-being. And as mentioned, we know that these attitudes and skills are necessary for environmental literacy. In fact, there are decades of research now that show that teaching towards environmental literacy develops social and emotional learning, and vice versa. So we're seeing this really interesting interplay. The research shows that environmental education has helped produce effective problem solvers, lifelong learners, and thoughtful community leaders and participants. So what exactly is SEL? There are a lot of terms out there, a lot of frameworks, a lot of definitions. You may have heard about 21st century skills, positive youth development, character building. There are all these different kind of terms for talking about what is essentially the same idea. They're about supporting young people to become caring, competent, and engaged members of society. And while SEL's been around for a while, it's really risen in prominence, particularly within the formal school settings, although we are hearing a lot about it in OST or, out of school settings as well. This definition here that I'm providing on the screen, this is one that is very commonly used by an organization called CASEL. That's CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And they are what I would point to as the leading institution that I recommend you spending some time looking into. They are the institution that's really kind of helped drive this process, in particular in the school setting, and have provided a lot of materials that schools have found really useful. I want to emphasize in this definition, there's one word there that's real important, and that's that word process. And just the way we think about environmental literacy being something that is a process, SEL is the same thing, right? It's not an endpoint, it's something that we are constantly engaging in. We are engaging in social and emotional learning right now. Every moment is an opportunity to be kind of thinking about, how you show up, how you're interacting with others, how are you feeling, that awareness, all of those kinds of skills are constantly kind of in play in interactions on our own, as well as with other people. Just like there are many definitions out there, although I did share the one that I think is kind of most commonly used, there are a lot of different frameworks out there that help to articulate what social and emotional learning is and how to develop it within young people. This again is from CASEL, and it is an image that you will see quite a lot if you haven't already. This kind of pie shape there that you see is where we can look at some of the specific skills that we're trying to support within the development of social and emotional learning. CASEL refers to them as the competencies. What's important to recognize also is that we're not just looking at kind of what students are learning, but how they're learning and where they're learning. And with this image, you can see just the importance of, they're looking at this in the school setting, right? So there's these classrooms, the schools, the kind of the larger home and community. And I would challenge you to think about, for whatever setting you're coming to, your perspective is kind of what are those concentric circles? When you work with your young people, kind of what are the supports? What are the settings that they interact with? And part of our job is to really think about how can we have a better understanding of what the various settings are and how we can be supportive of the student experience. And in particular, just that learning environment, right? The context in which learning takes place has become more and more important. And CASEL initially was just focused on those skills, and they've kind of broadened their understanding that it's, again, it's not just what you teach, but it's how, and looking at the learning context you know, those interactions between student and adult is really important. For us personally, you know, with my role at Nature Bridge, we did rely pretty heavily on this castle model, and you'll see when we spend time in the Grow Outside resource, we leaned on it as well, largely because this is the primary language that the school system is speaking, and as those were our primary partners, it felt really important that we be able to speak that language and be able to talk about kind of how our program could address and support young people in their social and emotional learning in a way that would be, you know, something that we knew that schools and districts were looking for, and, you know, was really helpful for the kind of reflection and improvement, you know, that we wanted to undertake in our own programs. I think it's important also to understand, like, what do those terms mean? So to dive in a little bit more and get some nuance within those competencies. So when we talk about, you know, responsible decision making, what does that actually mean? When we talk about, you know, self-awareness, really being able to understand some of the specifics, at least within this framework, can be really helpful just to ensure that we're on the same place. And just looking over these, you know, you might imagine that something might go in a slightly different category, or you might call it something slightly differently, and that's fine. We went through a big process like that at Nature Bridge, where we really looked at our own programming and kind of thought about what can we support in our program. And what we ended up with did not look exactly like this. But again, it was really important for us to still understand what language is used so that we can speak to it. There is one more framework that I want to throw out there just because they're doing such tremendous work. And I wanted to bring the SEL Alliance to your attention. The Science of Learning Development, or SEL, they have synthesized groundbreaking research from a number of different fields on how people learn. And it's so important to be able to really understand all of the different components that help to articulate how we can best support young people. So looking at those CASEL competencies, and I'll just go back one slide again. So take a look at those and just kind of glance through those different categories. When we think about the skills and competencies that we want young people to develop, looking at this other pie chart, this other pie, where would you see those competencies fitting? There's sort of some natural alignment, I'd say, especially on that kind of lower left section where we're looking at those intentional development, right? Those are the skills, the attitudes that we want young people to have. What I really appreciate about this particular model is that it considers not just those skills, but really looks at, like, how are we developing the young people? How are we supporting them in their development? So it's that whole child perspective. And you know, one of the criticisms in particular from some of the early social and emotional learning curriculum that's out there was that it was sort of presented as like a, you know, off the shelf, one size fits all, like, oh, we're doing SEL at 9:30 on a Tuesday. And really, it's like, it's so much more. You know, it doesn't just come from one activity or a reading. As we were saying earlier, it's in everything, in every interaction. It's the relationships you have with your students, how you interact with families, what you do to help each learner thrive. And we really have to assume that students have both the potential to learn and grow, and that they already come to you with skills and strengths that you can build on. And this is another area that, you know, SEL has gotten some criticism, and I really appreciate the recent growth because the focus should be on SEL, you know, coming from an assets-based position where you're really thinking about, you know, again, what are the strengths, what are the experiences, what are the skills that your students have, not just the deficits, and how can you build on those? And that's, I'd say, true with working with all students, but, you know, in particular, working with students who come from historically marginalized or underserved communities. So we spent some time earlier just kind of glancing through, thinking about some of the, you know, components of SEL, quality SEL. And I wanted to call out just some of the elements for effective environmental education that I'm aware of, and this comes from, the journal, they're listed on the bottom, Journal of Environmental Education, and those are some of the leading researchers who have been looking at environmental education and trying to understand what makes for, effective practice. I would love to hear from you all as EE experts. What else, when you think of what makes for quality environmental education? And we can use the chat, or if folks want to unmute. Is there anything that you think is missing on that list? Nice, I see that nature-centered. Absolutely. I know a lot of folks talk about the integration, multidisciplinary, in particular, an emphasis on science and science practices. Yeah, there's definitely more. So I wanted to acknowledge this is not like the end-all be-all list, but it does highlight some of what we might look for when we're thinking about or measuring, what is an effective EE program. And now I'm going to turn to you, and this is going to be your opportunity to unmute yourself. And I would love for us to have some conversation in thinking about, going back a slide, so some of those EE practices, and thinking about some of the skills specifically that we hope to support in young people through SEL. Where do you see some potential overlap between SEL and EE? Are there opportunities, do you think, in some of the ways you can set up environmental education where social and emotional learning can be supported and vice versa? I'll look at the first one that was shared in the chat, that nature-centered. Absolutely agree. Nature-centered could be a place where we're supporting EE, we're seeing local phenomena, we're exploring what's happening in the real world. If we're in a nature-based setting, could we possibly support some of these skills or competencies?
Absolutely. I wrote that one.
Great. Say more. What do you think?
Yeah. Without reading through this takes a lot of reading.
Sorry, the words are pretty small here.
So like just awareness, I think it matches up with being a good observer and like paying attention to what's going on around you and not just, so like nature-centered means like to use the phenomenon right in front of us, not like let's just play some game about deer and foxes outside, but actually use the phenomenon that's in front of us. And then by doing that, we're probably building more awareness on a lot of different levels about what's ourself in this place, but also the place around us, maybe.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add to that or share something new?
Yeah, I'll add to what Sarah was just talking about. It also, I was reading the responsible decision-making section, and being out in nature, there's genuine consequences for not making responsible decisions. I think of the times that I've taken, this time of year, go out and you remind everybody to have their coat, and somebody still forgets their coat, and you don't immediately go back and let them grab their coat because you reminded them. Eventually you have to, because it's part of keeping them safe. But there's a natural consequence for, oh yeah, I don't have my gloves with me, my fingers are going to be cold for a little while. And so that responsible decision making can definitely be a part of that.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about how your experiences or choices are influenced by the setting, and also how they impact the group. So what does that mean that the group then has to kind of go back and perhaps lose some time, for exploration because of a choice that you made? And so certainly there's some interplay there.
I've seen some overlap with self-confidence and environmental education, especially when I've worked with school groups. Sometimes, well, any kids in general, but sometimes there are kids that don't thrive in the normal academic setting or the setting they've been put in school, but yet when they're out in nature and do the more experiential learning, I've found them thriving, and teachers saying things like, I don't normally see this type of thing in this child. And, and so I think that self-confidence that comes about from doing hands-on and being outside and kind of exploring different areas that they might not always explore in school.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think so much of the personal growth and the interpersonal growth that we see in those types of programs absolutely speaks to, yes, there's content knowledge that, is acquired, ecological, understanding of ecological systems or scientific inquiry and whatnot that might happen in a hands-on program like that. And just such ripe opportunity as well for, what do you learn about yourself in being in a place like that? What type of confidence or kind of self-motivation, gets tapped. Certainly, I'd look to the relationship skills. I can't tell you how many times on teacher feedback forums we would hear about, oh my gosh, my kids were so much better at like collaborating and their team building. It became it was those skills that were really what the teachers were looking for in coming to our program, that the kind of environmental content, was like kind of the supports, and it was more of these kind of social and emotional skills that were longer lasting, that the students would take with them. Anything else that folks want to share?
I just wanted to add one thing. When I first learned about leave no trace principles, I learned about it in sort of how it could be transferred to like also culturally leave no trace. And I just think that like how social awareness, if you're aware of your impact on your environmental context and other organisms that are not even human, then sort of like that broad awareness of impact and others and perspective taking can then lead to also increased ability to do that with other classmates in a smaller sphere. Well, it might seem maybe more simplified, but by going bigger, and then it can have ripple effects interior to human relationships. So
I really appreciate that. And, in particular, one of the things that I think is really interesting that we're seeing a little bit of a shift in the study of environmental literacy, and in particular around behavior change, is that there has been so much focus up until now on like individual impact and individual behavior change. And actually what's I think even more exciting is the recent development, which is looking at collective impact and is looking at, how our decisions are made in relationship to other people around us and in our social, situations. And there's just so much opportunity to better understand how that happens, because it turns out that actually, there is a lot more than we think or has been given credit to that. And, really, really looking at those social influences are tremendously important. And, thinking about the kinds of change we want to see, when addressing something like climate change, right? This is such a huge topic that can feel overwhelming. And we know that it's not going to take an individual recycling to make the kind of impact that we need to see on a global scale, that it really will take perspective taking, teamwork, ethical responsibility, a lot of these components that we're seeing here. Well, thanks, everyone. I want to make sure that you do get an opportunity to explore this one resource that, Lisa mentioned. I do happen to have some personal involvement here, so I'm a little biased, but I think that this has a lot of value to add. And, this site came together through a collaboration of one particular program type. We were looking at residential settings, recognize that there are so many different types of EE settings out there. And when you were introducing yourselves in the chat, I saw, nature centers, just lots of different places that people are coming from. Just a few words before we dive into the site about these programs. for folks who aren't familiar with them, I know you do have some residential programs in Colorado. You know, typically programs are outside city centers. They're often on public lands, not always. But student groups live on site for multiple days. You know, they are learning alongside their classmates. And I do want to call out just, you know, the term residential itself can sometimes be triggering for Indigenous communities. It can bring to mind the practice of boarding schools, you know, where Native youth were removed from their families and stripped of their cultural heritage. And I think that just kind of language piece is something that kind of serves as an example of how important it is to be aware of the larger context in which our programs are taking place, and to kind of call on us to think about, you know, what is the historical trauma that needs to be attended to in the present day. And, you know, just as some participants might be really uncomfortable or fearful of spending the night away from home, you know, for others, being in a natural setting at all can be unsettling and can feel unsafe. And, you know, in thinking about social and emotional learning, kind of being aware of what students are coming to your program with, what kind of baggage, what kind of experiences, what kind of biases, you know, can be really helpful to identify some of those potential challenges and inspire us to, you know, really bring empathy, understanding, and compassion to our programs, doing our best to help our participants feel safe, welcome, you know, and included. There is some content within the site that is specific to residential programs, but a lot of it isn't, and that's why I wanted to share it with you today. I'm going to go ahead and then dive in myself. And are you seeing the same website that I'm seeing here? Are you seeing the growth site? Okay, good. I'm seeing some nods. Excellent. Sometimes that doesn't always transfer over in the Zoom share. So this is the website. It is grow-outside.org. So I wanted to just kind of walk with you through this and share a few of the resources that I think might be the most useful. Some of my favorites. So this was a tool that was created over a year-long partnership with a number of other centers across the nation. We wanted to make sure that we were taking in different types of programs, different structures, you know, looking at where we had similarities, and, you know, where we had kind of opportunity for really showcasing some of the highlights within our programs. We decided to focus our work in these different areas. So you'll see there's the organizational context. That's where we're really thinking about what's happening at the organizational level. You know, how are our hiring practices, our training practices, you know, how we set up, what is our office culture like, you know, asking those types of questions, because we know that that matters. And that's something that we're seeing within that castle wheel, is that, like, when you talk, they use the term of school climate, you know, thinking about what is the discipline policy at school, what is a relationship between the principal, you know, all the way down to the assistant teacher or student aide. And then similarly, what's it like in your organization? Is this something that everyone is expected to, you know, support? Is it something that is incorporated into your hiring processes, whether you're working in the field with, you know, young people or in an office position? If not, why not? Really looking at, like, your mission, your identity. The field practice is what I think might be most useful to all of you, and that's really, you know, thinking about that student engagement. So again, that learning environment, are you creating that rich space where students can learn and thrive? You know, what does actually, like, really specific instruction on social and emotional learning look like? And what are those sort of embedded opportunities that are sort of those happy accidents, you know, that just happen naturally in these types of programs? The residential setting, you know, you'll see is a little bit more unique to this type of a program. But there are pieces here that I would, you know, welcome you to think about, that some of these might be applicable in a different type of setting. So for example, we do talk about supporting transgender and gender expansive youth in these settings because they're overnight and there's the sleeping component. You know, there are some pieces there that are kind of unique to that. And we all have programs where we have students and staff who may be gender expansive. And so thinking about how to support them, there's some materials there for you. Similarly, you know, you might have students take on different roles and responsibilities in your programs. And while some of these are unique to residential, not always. And then the last piece, is in engaging stakeholders. And we really wanted to look both internally and externally. So thinking about how do you make the case for, why is this important to bring to your site? There's some language here and some resources for you, as well as how do you articulate out to others that like, hey, we support social and emotional learning. And again, kind of building on what I was saying earlier about being able to walk the talk, so thinking about how can you increase capacity? What are the types of relationships that you want to build in your community to help support social and emotional learning? So there's a lot of clickable links within this site to get examples from different programs and kind of what they did. How do you market your program? Some tips for that, stuff like that. So I wanted to just give you kind of an overview of this whole site. If you tend to be a resource nerd like I am, it can be really fun to come to this page, which just has, like, these are all of the specific tools that you would see that are printable. You can share this with a colleague, download it yourself within each one of these different categories. So one of them in particular I wanted to highlight is this first one. This is the reflection tool. And this is, it's a lengthy tool, but really the idea is if you want to do some deep work as an organization in social and emotional learning, we recommend that you start here, where you spend some time working with several staff members. It's most effective if you have, a few people to work with. And, the idea is that for each of these categories, and again, we could do organizational context, field practice, residential setting, etc. We ask these different questions. There's no right or wrong answer. It's really a, to what degree does our organization, or to what degree do our staff, do some of these things and practice some of these kind of exemplary, components of social and emotional learning. So here you can see talking about your organization's mission and policies. I'll slide down a little bit just so you can see some of the other categories and what this looks like. So for example, to what degree do all staff have the opportunity to influence and develop the training and professional development plans, at the site? So there's a lot here. But the idea is that this is a place to start to identify areas where your organization really shines and some opportunities for improvement, and to compare notes with your colleagues and say, oh, I think we do really well at that, and someone else says, no, I think actually we don't. And that's so interesting. Why do we have this disconnect? Well, here's my experience. Oh, here's my experience. Let's learn from that. So the idea is that it's a reflection tool. It's not an evaluation tool, but a reflection tool to look at opportunities to deepen SEL within your organization. And you might choose to just focus on one of these areas or undertake all of it. And we kind of invite you to think about what is the right fit for your site. A few other tools I wanted to highlight. This is one that we've heard from educators is one of their absolute favorites. We talk about reflection is something that is so important for any type of learning, and those debrief questions, the power of the debrief. I had a wonderful colleague that I worked with for a while. He basically would say, if you didn't debrief it, it didn't happen. Well, that was a little harsh. I was like, yeah, there's some truth to that, right? If we don't actually stop and reflect on the learning, it tends to be, maybe I'll remember the experience, but I don't necessarily remember what I gained from it. I don't necessarily remember how it moved me or made me think. And that's what's really important. And so being able to have a lot of different types of debrief questions, we tend to ask some of the same ones or the ones that we're comfortable with. And this can really help to push us, out of those go-tos and perhaps, bring in more of these SEL, especially if your program is more science-based. You can keep that scientific rigor, but make sure that you're still bringing in, weaving in some of these questions, what did you learn from yourself, about yourself while doing this exercise? Or how did team members rely on each other, to be successful in conducting this investigation? And here's just a different version of the same material. So these are designed so that they can be printed out onto index cards. You can have them laminated in your back pocket, or even hand out to a student if you have a student leader that says, hey, will you pick up a question for us, to ask on our next hike or, whatever. And that could be a great way of helping them to get some ownership and perhaps demonstrate leadership, like trying out some of those roles. One last resource that I wanted to share out within this tool is the Field Instructor Guide. So this is a tool. It's sort of separate from the first reflection. That's looking organizationally, where you're looking at kind of your collective approach to supporting SEL. This one is for you to look personally within each of these competencies. And, so for example, here I am with self-awareness, where there are a lot of different questions here for me to consider. And this can be used as a tool for me to do my own reflection as an educator. If I'm a supervisor, it could be used as something I might, want to bring in some of these questions into, an annual check-in. I'd say not so much as an evaluation, but really an opportunity for reflection and growth, really thinking about, looking at, for example, there's one here that kind of highlights, in particular, that overlap that we were talking about between SEL and equity and inclusion, thinking about cultural bias and how that might show up in your teaching. And, what are those implicit biases? Maybe looking at some of those tools out there, like the Harvard implicit bias, assessment. That's such a great tool. And then thinking about, well, how might that, impact my teaching? So like everything on this site, it is based on that CASTLE framework. It goes through all of the, different categories here. And then the second piece is, in addition to my own reflection at my own practice, there also is that more student-directed, what am I doing to specifically support students, and how am I supporting this competency within my work with students? So that's how this one is organized. Before I move on, are there any questions from you all about just this this tool in terms of the design or what's on here?
I have a quick question about the student debrief questions.
Yeah.
From the folks that you've worked with or your own experience, do you find that it's helpful for students to maybe reflect on those verbally or writing? And how much do you ask them to share out those reflections? Because some of them seem a little bit sort of personal, and I'm wondering how you navigate that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would say yes, and to all of it, right? I think it really depends on the age range of the students that you're working with and how deep your program is. So if you're on like a 2-week backpacking course with your students, you can go real deep, and you can move from, that I'm just talking to myself to, ooh, maybe I'm sharing with a partner, to maybe I'm sharing with, a small group, to like, yep, it's expected that I'm going to lay it all out, with the full group. So thinking about scaffolding how much you share, starting with, we do often an activity, where you're in concentric circles, and you might be asking like, what did you have for breakfast this morning? Or, talk about a time in nature or a place that you like to go in nature, asking a question that's sort of a low risk, and then building up to a higher risk, where you are sharing some of those deeper and more personal types of questions. So absolutely, I think within the debrief, there are opportunities where it might even be just a question that you ask out loud and ask folks to think about themselves and ponder. I'd say the deeper learning happens when you are actually hearing from others and having to formulate, your own response. So the more you can work up to that, the better. And to acknowledge that if you're in a day program, or maybe you only have kind of several hours with students, in a nature setting, that might not be feasible. And so it might be something that you have students write some questions in a journal that they can take home with them, or perhaps it's something that you're doing more of the like, just say the question and let them think. A lot of these questions can work really well if you're trying to get from point A to point B. A lot of times they're like, what do I do at that time? Do they just chat about their favorite video game? Which can be totally fun and appropriate for them just to get to hang out and get to know each other. But can also be a really tremendous opportunity to use that as a learning or teaching time. So whether it's a personal reflection, using one of those debrief questions, or having them partner up and, like, okay, let's talk about what just happened, share with your partner about the activity we just did. And then when you get into your next site, that's where you can say, great, you know, who wants to share out? So that's something that we see educators use a lot. I see the question in the chat about there being PD learning modules. There's nothing quite like that on here. There is in the organizational context. I know we have some, there are some staff training suggestions that we have certain types of activities. Let's see, where are we? I know, yeah, there's like an intro to SEL that we could recommend incorporating. We worked also with the Beatles program out of UC Berkeley. So they were one of our program partners. I see a lot of nodding happening here. So we actually hired them as consultants to continue this project, and they developed some additional materials that are kind of in collaboration with this. So they do have a whole wonderful resource that is specifically focused on SEL and outdoor science that I would recommend. And they are now also reviewing a lot of their materials that they created several years ago with an SEL and an equity lens. So for example, I'm just curious, how many of you have used the I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me Of? Yeah, I see a lot of hands. If you don't know that material, it's fantastic. I highly recommend you check it out. Great way for bringing in observation and, you know, really having a personal connection to something that you're observing in the natural world. They have a new one that's SEL focused, where you're actually turning that activity onto the community and onto the group. And so they have some great new stuff on their website. And one of the particular resources, I think it's on the overview page, was one that they worked on with us.
I would just add that it doesn't actually say that on the I Notice, I Wonder. You have to just know that the one that's there, the PDF to download, is the 2020 version. So if you downloaded it in 2019 or before, go download it again, and it's the new one.
Thank you for that tip. That's great. Yeah, and so this concept paper here that you'll see, this is on the field practice site. This has typical Beatles, like a lot of resources, a lot of language around kind of what to do, what not to do, and things like that. Any other questions? These are great. Okay, cool. So I'll make sure that you have my contact information. So if you want to reach out and chat, you certainly can do so. Okay, so these were the ones that I highlighted when I share this slideshow with Lisa and Katie. You know, we'll make sure that you get access to this as a PDF. So if you want to go back to one of those specifically, you'll see it. So I wanted us to have an opportunity to get to practice together and do a reflection. This is a water metaphor exercise. For this activity, I am going to put you into a small group where you're going to get to interact with a few other folks who are on this call. And this is your opportunity to make some connections to some type of body of water and relate that to just how you're feeling about the end of 2020 and going into a new year. 2020 has been a year of just so many things. Hopefully a lot of positive in your life in addition to a whole lot of challenge. And we want you to think about a body of water that represents how you are feeling in this moment. So I'm going to give you just a minute to kind of pause and sit with yourself thinking about this question.
Estrella, I think I've got the breakout room. So I can give you that, or you can tell me how many rooms you'd like.
No, that's perfect. What we're going to do is we're going to go into rooms of like 2 to 3 people in each room. And you will have about 4 minutes in your room. And the idea is to just have a chance to check in with this person. I want to recognize you may be with someone that you know, you may be with someone you don't know. So think about what you're comfortable sharing. You know, it's an opportunity to perhaps get to know somebody a little bit. but please pay attention to your time and, make sure that the partner or partners have an opportunity to talk a little about what body of water you chose and why. So how does that represent how you're feeling in this moment?
And Estrella, you said about 5 minutes. Is that what you
Let's take like 4 minutes.
Okay. All right. In a second, you'll see a blue button that says to join a room. And we will pull you back in about 4 minutes. Anything else before we send people away, Estrella?
I will put the prompt in the chat as well.
Oh, perfect. Okay, I'll wait for you to do that.
I see some of us back in, not quite everybody. Some folks are holding on to the bitter end.
We should all be coming back now.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for participating in that exercise. Metaphor can be a really powerful tool, a way to help develop connections with the natural world while giving folks a chance to explore feelings and thoughts. I find, especially in these virtual settings, it can be really comforting to get to even just have a visual image of, one of these beautiful wild places. So I just want you to have a little kind of pause to reflect, how was that? Did you find yourself connecting to something that someone else said? Did anything surprise you? And going back to the competencies that I shared earlier, this is just a chance to kind of think, how did this particular activity support one of these competencies? Was there something about myself, something about the way that I was interacting with others?
I think for me, at least, I noticed that it makes you kind of think of self-awareness and like identifying your emotions, as well as like the decision making almost. Might be kind of a stretch, but under the specific categories where it says like evaluating and reflecting, you're kind of evaluating what's happened over time and reflecting and trying to make a connection to something new. So at least in like EE, we're connecting to something that we might be familiar with in nature and how that is ourselves right now and our emotions.
I love that. Thank you.
I've been hosting a nature book club, and that activity just I think I'm going to infuse that into the virtual book club, because we often are like reading about birds or mushrooms, and I can foresee myself. I often am like, how'd you guys like the book? And I think the picture model is something I'll utilize in that, because I think it's a bit easier for people to identify with photos from nature as opposed to like coming up with those emotions on their own. So I think, again, evaluating, as Carly just mentioned, will be helpful. So thank you for that. I'm going to put that in my back pocket to use in another format, another program.
You're welcome. Yeah, I've seen it used I've used it myself, using water as a metaphor, using, parts of a tree. I mean, there's a lot of different directions you could go if you want to focus on nature. Well, we are coming to the end of our hour here, and just kind of want to call out, the focus on social and emotional learning, I feel like, is especially timely, in our current situation. Coronavirus has stripped away the layers of artifice and barriers between us, leading us to remember what is most important, how the connections we have and will build with each other will nurture and sustain us. SEL is critical for supporting students to connect and learn about the natural world and develop meaningful relationships with adult instructors. SEL is in a healthy work environment, whether that be within the walls of a classroom, on a trail, or in the staff room. SEL is essential for us as adults, informing how we show up each day and what we bring to our students, our colleagues, and in our personal lives. I want to thank you all for spending this last hour with me and with each other. And often I like to frame debrief as a what, so what, now what? What happened? Why does this matter? And what will I do with what I learned? So I'll kind of let this be just a personal reflection for you, an opportunity for you to think about any particular takeaways you might have or anything you want to bring to your own practice, kind of look back on dig in more perhaps from the Grow Outside site. And again, thank you for spending this time with us and for supporting your Colorado affiliate. What a great group of folks you all have. And again, I'll share these materials out, so please do reach out if you have questions, and I'll look to Lisa to close us out.
Wow, that was fantastic, Estrella. Thank you so much. I know I learned a lot, and these tools, I know I'm going to be printing and looking at a lot in the future. So thank you for joining us for the hour, and thank all of you also for joining us this hour. We hope everyone keeps safe and have a nice holiday, and we will plan to see you in the new year. And as I mentioned, I'll be following up with an email with the recording, as well as some links to the resources that Estrella mentioned today. Thank you, everyone. Have a great holiday. We'll see you in the new year.
Bye, folks.